Hello. Welcome. Welcome to 2022 Ridgefield Library Hot Stove Conversation with Gary Cohen. I don't know how Edwin Diaz can't get super pumped up when listening to that music. And we all get excited and then a little nervous, right? So, how many Mets fans do we have out here in the audience today? And fans of Gary, Keith, and Ron? Yeah. Well, we've got a great treat in store for you this afternoon. My name is David Yawn, and I'm a former member of the Board of Directors of the Ridgefield Library, and I'll be your host here today. A little bit of housekeeping. We do ask, and it looks like everyone's complying, that you keep your mask on during the event, unless you're actively eating or drinking. There are some spaces, so we tried to make it possible for those of you who are more comfortable socially distant. It looks like we have done that. If you have any concerns or questions, just let one of the ushers know. Now, you may think you're here for a discussion about the Mets, broadcasting, the upcoming baseball season, knock wood, but you're actually here for another reason as well. This is a fundraiser for the Ridgefield Library, and it's important that the library raise funds through programs like this because 1/3 of the annual operating budget of the library comes from donations. If you do the math, that pretty much means for the library to be open, it needs donations. And what you've done today by purchasing a ticket, especially those of you in the VIP section here, is going a long way towards helping us with our goal of setting a record this year with the most money raised with a hot stove event. Thank you. We do have some additional options for those of you haven't figured it out already, you saw it as you walked in. We do have limited edition Hot Stove 2022 Hot Stove t-shirts. A limited number are still available out in the lobby. We will not be offended if you go back and buy one. And as you probably saw, there are raffle prizes out there. We have 2 book packages featuring Bobby Valentine, Jay Horwitz, and Once Upon a Time in Queens, the ESPN 30/30 special that was on last summer. It's a book, no DVDs coming out, unfortunately. We have signed Hot Stove t-shirts. Gary signed 4 t-shirts, and those are available by raffle, and you won't be able to get them signed later, so that will be your chance to get signed t-shirts. And we have some Mets collectibles out there. But the really important thing is our auction. And we have some extraordinary Mets experiences and collectibles available for auction up until 1:30 today. We have 2 Mets games packages, one from Citi and one from SNY. The Citi package features some Pete Alonso collectibles, and the SNY one, appropriately enough, features some Gary, Keith, and Ron collectibles. We have dinner for 4 with, emphasis on with, Bobby Valentine, the former Mets manager. Bobby will host you personally at his restaurant, Bobby V's in Stamford, Connecticut. We have a bottle of Tom Seaver's 2017 GTS Cabernet, outstanding wine from the Seaver Vineyards. You cannot buy this in stores, and good luck getting on their waiting list. It will take you years before you'll be able to buy something directly from the vineyard, but you can get a bottle here today. From Tom Seaver's vineyard. We have an autographed ball from Hall of Famer Mike Piazza, and we have 2 packages featuring some guy named Keith. Apparently you know who he is. One is a signed ball and an autographed copy of his children's book, which is appropriately enough called First Base Hero. And something that I think is really outstanding, I was going to pick it up here, but I don't want to drop it. We have an ultra-rare signed scorecard that was used by Keith while broadcasting a 2021 Mets victory. I believe it's June 19th against the Nationals. I know for a fact that Francisco Lindor hit 2 home runs and had 5 RBIs in that game, which was a 7-inning win. And it is beautiful. Gary and I will talk about it a little bit later in the program. And I think that covers our auction items. Gary and I, a little bit on the format, Gary and I agreed to a couple topics that we're going to talk about beforehand. Obviously, we're going to talk about the off-season changes with the Mets, broadcasting, especially in the era of COVID, And the last segment, we'll talk about some Mets heroes and Mets history. But there's going to be plenty of opportunity for you guys to ask questions. So literally, there were 3 or 4 times during this where we'll pause and we'll put up the house lights. There are people with microphones. The good news is the microphones will be cleaned between each use, so you don't have to worry about that. Trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, and then after the event, Gary's going to stick around, and you'll be able to come up here on stage and get, if you have baseballs or items that you want signed. We also have, for everyone that is attending, a commemorative certificate suitable for framing. It's also suitable for signing. And everyone will get one of these, whether you come up on stage or if you have to leave when the event is over, they'll have some at the front desk as well. So I think I've covered everything, so it's probably time to bring out someone who, with this audience, literally needs no introduction. The person I think is the best play-by-play announcer in all professional sports. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Gary Cohen.
Thank you.
There's some added irony. Gary's walk-off song is the Ramones, I Don't Want to Go in the Basement, and the last 2 times we did this, we did it in the basement of the library.
You know, you are obviously a very attentive listener because very few people probably heard that conversation that we had about potential walk-up music. And I said that off the top of my head, and then I thought about it, and I don't want to go to the basement is a very baseball thing. No player, no team wants to be in the basement, but mostly it's about the Ramones, the greatest band the Queens has ever produced. So it's perfectly appropriate.
And hopefully by the time this is over, people won't be thinking, I want to be sedated, but or beat on the brat, I don't know.
I think that people would just like to see a baseball game sometime before June.
Yeah, that is true. So Gary, I was thinking about this. We were supposed to do this last year around this time. We tried so hard to make that happen, and we just couldn't pull it off. But I started thinking in the interim about, since we last spoke in January 2019, some things that have happened. A New York Met, set the major league record for home runs by a rookie and won the Rookie of the Year. Probably more believable for us Mets fans, a Mets pitcher won his 2nd consecutive Cy Young. 126th Street in Queens became 41 Seaver Way. The Mets played 60 games in front of 0 fans, which I believe ties a major league record. They went 189 and 195 over those 3 seasons, which actually sounds better than it seemed.
That's about par for the course, yeah.
The team actually led the division for more than 3 months and finished 11 and a half games out. Since January 2019, the Mets have had 4 managers. Since January 2019, the Mets have had 4 general managers and 5 if you count what Sandy did in August and September of last year. And during this time, they agreed to sell the team. The deal fell through, and then a few months later, they sold to the same exact guy. So a typical 3 years with the Mets. So let's start with the obvious. We have to talk about the impact of Steve Cohen and the changes. And is it safe to say that it's quite likely Steve Cohen will define the next 2 decades of New York baseball?
Well, I think that in any organization, whether it's sports or otherwise, performance generally reflects upper leadership. The Wilpons very much wanted to win, but didn't necessarily have the resources, financial and otherwise, to win consistently. Steve Cohen has been successful in his primary business and clearly wants to win the way the Wilpons wanted to win, but he's got the financial resources and the ability to acquire the other resources that he needs to win. So, what does that mean? It means a beefed up training staff and analytics people and scouting department and minor league facilities and on and on and on. Does that guarantee success? Of course not. Look at the Angels. The Angels have a very rich owner and have spent an enormous amount of money over the last several years. They've got the best player in baseball, last year's best player in baseball, a different guy, and yet they've been completely unsuccessful. Now, it doesn't escape notice that the Mets' new general manager came from that organization. Now, the question is, does the way Steve Cohen approaches spending his money differ from the way the Angels owner, Artie Moreno, spends his money and runs his organization? And the answer is, we don't know yet. Last year was a testing ground for just about everybody in the organization, and you'd have to say on a lot of counts, they failed miserably, even though they were in first place for good half the season. So now the question becomes, does Steve and the people under him, Sandy Alderson and now Billy Eppler, do they have the talent to be able to put the systems in place and the people in place who will turn that around and create an extended period of success? And I think that remains to be seen. But there's no question that Steve has the financial resources to do it, to make the choices and spend the money to put a system in place that hopefully will be able to do that. And this is why they play the games, because you just don't know the answer to that.
What you mentioned the new GM, and what for those of us who really aren't inside baseball, what is the reputation of Billy Eppler, and what do you know about him that fans should know about?
Yeah, I don't know any more than what I read, because I've never met Billy. Let me just say parenthetically, because we're going to talk about this later, but I think this is important to know. The last 2 years have been different for a million different reasons. But from my perspective in my job, one of the things that has changed completely is that I don't see the people that I'm covering face to face. And it makes all the difference in the world. I've gone from, being in the clubhouse every day, being able to talk to players face to face, one-on-one, getting to know them. Same thing with the manager, same thing with the front office. In the last 2 years, I've had maybe 5 face-to-face conversations with the people that I cover. It's very different, and in many ways very frustrating, because you asked me about Billy Eppler. I've never met Billy Eppler. I don't know when I'm going to meet Billy Eppler, because who knows when this season's going to begin. So what I know about him is his reputation. He worked in the Yankees organization, was very highly regarded there, got the job with the Angels. He signed Mike Trout to a long-term contract. He brought in Shohei Ohtani. Those things very much work in his favor. But they didn't win. So, again, remains to be seen how successful he'll be here.
Well, his first move, I guess, right, was hiring the manager. Well, I guess there was free agent signings, which we'll talk about in a minute. But what do fans think about Buck Showalter being the Mets manager? Now, clearly, you've talked to Buck probably many times in the last couple decades.
Yeah, Buck is a fascinating guy. I mean, he became a big league manager when he was 35, and he was not a popular choice when the Yankees hired him, but he proved to be a great pick. Buck knows the game, loves the game, knows the intricacies of it, sees things that other people don't necessarily see, understands what it takes to be a winning team. The knock on Buck has always been that he's been something of a control freak, and that's kind of hurt him in his earlier incarnations. But I go back to when the Mets brought in Terry Collins, and the knock on him was that he didn't relate to his players well, that he didn't understand the modern player, and he could not have been more 180 from what his reputation was. He was fantastic in terms of his communication, and I think that Buck has reached an age now where he understands what his limitations were in terms of his, need to control everything. And I think also he's operating in a different era now, where a manager doesn't have the kind of power that he's had in the past, that it's much more of a collaborative experience with the front office, with the analytics people, with ownership. And I think that he's the perfect man for the job that the Mets present right now, because this is a team that has certainly disappointed the last couple of years. I go back to 2019, and it looked like all of the pieces were there to have an extended run of success. And, the shortened season was a disaster, and last season was a disappointment. And I still believe that there are the pieces there to certainly be a postseason team and be a contender for a championship team. And maybe Buck is the guy to make that happen.
Obviously, there's a lot of discussion leading up to the hiring of Buck's first day when he was being interviewed, on analytics. And there's been some scuttlebutt over the last couple of weeks that perhaps the analytics team had a little too much control over the decision-making that was coming out of the dugout. Do you think, do you think Buck will have a different approach or insist on a different approach? And two, how fair was that, and maybe in relationship to Luis Rojas?
Yeah, I think that there are a lot of threads involved there. Analytics has become, in many organizations, the be-all, end-all. And it can't be that. It can be an enormously helpful tool for organizations in terms of creating their own proprietary analytics that help them judge players, and using the more widely available numbers that we can all look up if we're so inclined. I know from a fan's perspective, and I know this from talking to people, most fans don't give a whit about the numbers, and you don't need to. You can be a great fan without caring about WRC plus or any of the esoteric numbers that teams look at today. But just know that they are using those numbers every day to make decisions about who to acquire, who to play, who to get rid of, who to play where, batting orders, all that stuff. So that exists. It exists in every organization. The best organizations use a combination of analytics and traditional scouting, looking at a player, looking at his tools, looking at his potential with eyeballs as well as with spreadsheets. The key in terms of putting all this into motion has become how you take the numbers, crunch them, and put them into a digestible form for each individual player. And that's a lot harder than it seems. If you, as a numbers person, as a front office person in the major leagues, understand that the pitcher that your team is going to be facing today throws his changeup 73% of the time on a 2-2 count, that's great. But as a hitter standing in the batter's box, you can't be thinking, well, it's 2-2, he's going to throw his changeup 73% of the... You can't do that. Yogi Berra has the most famous quote of all time about hitting. He said, "You can't think and hit at the same time." And it's true. So, the teams that are most successful, and this is maybe the hardest job now in baseball, figure out how to take the information that will help the players be more successful, but put it in a digestible form that won't overload their brains. I think it's a little easier for pitchers to absorb this stuff because they have the time. They create the action, right? Pitching is proactive, hitting is reactive. So if a pitcher knows this hitter's weakness is in this spot, particularly in this count, he's got 15 or 20 seconds to work with his catcher to come to that conclusion, throw the right pitch in the right spot. And it's part of the reason why pitching is so dominant right now. But a hitter can't do that. A hitter's got 3 to 4/10 of a second to react to what he sees. And if he has too much information in his brain, it's very hard to react. And I think that, I said this is multi-layered in terms of threads. I think that because Luis Rojas was a relatively inexperienced manager, when the Mets put the systems in place to bring a lot of that information to the players, I don't think Luis necessarily had the standing to get in the way of that and say, whoa, this is not productive the way that you are presenting this to my players. We need to do this differently. I think that because Buck is who he is and has the standing that he does, that won't happen the same way. So those dynamics are happening with every team right now. Clearly, there were issues last year with the way information was presented, and it did feel at times as though the hitters were somewhat overwhelmed. And you could see it because they were taking fastballs, swinging late on fastballs, fouling back fastballs. Traditional hitting, and Keith will tell you this all the time, is to look for a fastball, adjust to a breaking ball. Now, hitters, in a lot of cases, and part of it's because of the way pitching has evolved, are looking for breaking balls. It's a hard thing to adjust to a fastball if you're looking for a breaking ball. It's like a catcher who calls for a curveball and gets a fastball, he's likely to get hit in the face. It's the same thing for hitters. So how that evolves with the Mets is going to be one of the fascinating things to keep an eye on this year. Not necessarily something you're going to know because those things tend to get hidden in the shadows, but you can see it. And I think we saw it last year in the negative, and maybe we'll see it this year in the positive.
You talked a little bit about how analytics and analysis can determine who gets acquired, and I'm going to let the audience ask about at least one of the big acquisitions off-season. One of you must have a question about that. But I thought it was kind of intriguing, the two maybe lesser-known names that they signed, Eduardo Escobar and Marcana. And I was wondering if you could give us your thoughts on those two joining the Mets and what their impact is going to be.
Well, I think both are terrific players. I think the overall theme of what the Mets did in the offseason so far, because the offseason is still going, and when they finally settle this thing, there's going to be an enormous flurry of activity, whether that's more free agents, trades, whatever. But they brought in older players who have been very successful. That doesn't necessarily jibe with the way that baseball has evolved over the last few years. The Mets have been living with a relatively young core the last few seasons. But, you know, Escobar and Canna and Marte are, 33, 34-year-old players, and Max Scherzer is going to be 38 this summer. So that kind of cuts against the grain. That having been said, Escobar has been one of my favorite players for a long time. Not a high on-base percentage, but for a little guy, tremendous power. Think of Jonathan VR, but with more power and the ability to play the same positions that VR did last year. And VR was fantastic. I would love to have seen them bring him back, and who knows. But Escobar is that guy. Canna, I don't really know as well because he's been in the American League. Right-hand hitter, people have talked about him platooning maybe, but he's actually better against right-hand pitching than he is against left-hand pitching. So, yeah, the Mets have a lot of pieces to sort out. I mean, other than Lindor at shortstop, I don't think that you, and McCann behind the plate, I don't think you can properly say right now that you know where anybody's going to be playing opening day, right? I mean, Alonso could be playing first, he could be DHing. Second base, I don't know, Jeff McNeil, Escobar, Robinson Cano. Third base could be Escobar, could be J.D. Davis, could be McNeil. The outfield, does Marte necessarily play center, or does Nimmo play center? I think that's an open question, even though I think most people think Marte is going to play center. Nimmo made great strides there last year, and Marte is getting a little older. There are a lot of pieces. Where does Dom Smith fit in? Does Jeff McNeil fit in? Does J.D. Davis fit in? There are a lot of open questions, and if we have a shortened spring training and a flurry of activity right before that starts, there might be even more questions. And with a new manager and a new general manager, they're going to have to learn a lot on the fly about the guys they're inheriting.
I don't know if you're giving me confidence or making me nervous. Quickly, of the names that have left, who are we going to miss the most?
Aaron Loop, without question. I mean, Aaron Loop was just an amazing story last year. He had made great strides in the couple of years before in Toronto and Tampa Bay, but he was the Mets' best relief pitcher by far last year. Just a great presence on the mound, great attitude. The beer in the post-game Zoom press conferences, the whole thing. He was fantastic, and the Mets really don't have anybody to replace him right now. They're going to have to find themselves a prime left-hander out of the pen.
Yeah. Well, we're going to open up for questions. I have to do about every 15, 20 minutes, remind you about raffles and auction. I'm looking at the auction prices. There are some good deals still out there right now. The game packages are significantly lower than the last 2 times we've done it. And I am shocked at the current price of the Keith Hernandez signed scorecard. Someone's going to be
Have you shown them
incredible.
this Keith Hernandez?
We may have to unwrap it at some point.
Because it's a 2-sided scorecard, right? And Keith's got all of his Disraeli Gears colors on it, and it's framed in a shadow box so that you can look at both sides in the frame, and he signed it. So it's a very, very cool item.
And there's little fun things, like there's just a random 6'4" written in one place on it. And I don't know which player it's about, but it's someone. There's little notes to himself.
Now, come on. You've been watching Keith long enough to have some idea how his brain does and does not work. So it should not surprise you at all.
He's also got the neatest handwriting.
Well, he's Catholic school. You know?
Yeah, exactly.
Ronny and Keith, both Catholic school. My handwriting, nobody can read. Theirs, perfect.
So if we can put up the house lights, we are going to take audience questions. We have our mic wranglers right now in the back. In the interest of time, just based on the last 2 times we did this, we're not going to take any questions about the following people. It says here Keith Jackson, Keith Olbermann, Keith Urban, Keith Richards, who might be down the street at Luce right now. No questions about Keith Moon, Keith Miller, Keith Partridge. For that matter, Brian Keith. Also Angel Hernandez, Kiki Hernandez, Levon Hernandez, Orlando Hernandez. None of those today, but any other combination of those names is okay. So who's going to do the first question here? I'm going to go, there's a gentleman holding up I think he's holding up his auction thing over there, probably in row 6 or 7 over there.
Gary, first of all, thank you.
What's your name?
Dan.
Hi, Dan.
First of all, thank you for many years of service to this team. You, Keith and Ron, are the only reasons I watch during blowouts. I don't do that for other teams because it's just not fun. But my question is about the '86 team. How do you think the Mets would have done if it was the Angels they put in the World Series? Easier, tougher? Because I feel like they're the forgotten team. Like, I never hear anything about them.
Yeah, and when you do, it's usually the tragic story of Donnie Moore, right?
Again, I don't know who that is, but I'll take your word for it.
It's tragic.
The Angels led the Red Sox in the League Championship Series 3-1, and they were about to clinch the series when Donnie Moore gave up the key home run to Dave Henderson, and the Red Sox rallied and won the series. And Donnie wound up taking his own life a couple of years later. So that's a terrible story, but that has become the definition of the '86 Angels. I can't really say one way or another. I don't remember that team well enough from top to bottom to really express an opinion. I do know that they did not have Calvin Schiraldi, and the Red Sox having Calvin Schiraldi, who was a former Mets pitcher, whom the Mets players knew well, and had that great deer in the headlights look in every shot you see of him during the '86 series. That certainly worked in the Mets' favor. I don't think the Angels had anybody like Calvin Schiraldi.
All right, thank you.
Do we have a question way back in the back there? Why don't we do that one next?
Yeah, hi, Gary. I'd like to know a little more about you
Where am I looking?
personally.
Where am I looking?
He's way over there on the left-hand side. Or
hi.
left-hand side.
How you got into broadcasting, how you came to Ridgefield, A little more personal stuff would be great.
Okay.
Social security number,
This could,
mother's
this
maiden
could
name.
take the
Are
rest
you
of the.
Keith and Ron friendly?
Are we friendly? Do we sound friendly?
You do. Yeah, you do.
I mean, that would be hard to fake for 500 hours a year, right? I'll start there because, I knew Keith and Ron briefly as players. My first year with the Mets was 1989. That was Keith's last year with the Mets, so I got to know him just a little bit. And Ronny was there for a couple more years before he got traded. So I knew them that way, and obviously they knew each other from having played with each other. But I didn't really have a relationship with either one. And what's been great over the last 16 or so years is getting to know them as people. Ronny is exactly the way I remembered him, in that he is very thoughtful, very kind, incredibly hardworking, just generous to a fault. Keith is exactly the opposite of what I remembered of him as a player. He was. They used to call him the Prince of Darkness. He was intense, focused, kind of humorless. He was all business. And now he is exactly the opposite. He's the guy who stood at the edge of his hot tub to try and trim his flowers on the pergola and fell over and nearly killed himself last year. So he's the guy who has the cat who crawls on his shoulder all day, and he's a warm and fuzzy uncle, and I could have never imagined him evolving this way. Ronny always says, this is not the guy I played with. So that's that, and we have a great time. We do. It's every day is a joy because those guys. There's nobody I would rather work with in this world than those two. I can throw anything up in the air, and they always have a way of catching it before he hits the ground. And I can't say anything better about them than that. As for me, my goal was to be a shortstop for the Mets or a power forward for the Knicks. I didn't grow to be 6'9", so that took out the second part, and I had absolutely no talent for baseball, so that took out the first part. I got an AM radio in my room when I was 9 years old and loved listening to games. Marv Albert is probably the biggest reason that I'm here today. In those days, Marv was doing the radio home games for the Knicks and Rangers, and I would listen religiously to all of those games. And I'd also obviously listen to Lindsey, Ralph, and Bob doing the Mets, and I'd pick up distant signals of other games from other markets, and Merle Harmon doing the Jets, and Al Albert doing the Nets, and I listened to all of them. It never occurred to me as a kid that that was something that I could actually do, but when I got to college, I found that there was such a thing as a college radio station that broadcast games, first at Penn and then at Columbia, and after I'd done that for a few years, I realized I liked it and decided to pursue it. And, everything kind of flowed down from there. I was not in sports when I first came out of college. I did news at various different stations. Over the course of the first 5 years out of college, I was a DJ. I did fishing and boating reports. I did a tax show. The one thing that I didn't do that the radio station I worked for in Virginia wanted me to do was they did traffic reports. They didn't use a helicopter. They used a light plane to fly. And I went up one day with the guy who did it regularly. They wanted to train me to be his backup. And my stomach said no. One day of looping the loop and flying around the Hampton Roads area of Virginia, that was it for me. I was out of that. But along the way, I got a chance to do minor league baseball briefly in Spartanburg, South Carolina in '83 and '84. I got my first full-time minor league baseball job in Durham, North Carolina in 1986. The next year I went to Pawtucket, Rhode Island, and did the AAA team for the Red Sox for 2 years. And I was fortunate enough to get the Mets job in '89, and I've been here ever since.
Thank you.
One of the beauties of technology is that I can get little hints from the audience, and I was reminded by Lynn that I have not mentioned that for the auction, all of you should have a booklet that has QR codes in it, so you can just scan that QR code with your phones and make your bids without leaving the room. So just a reminder of that. Thank you, Lynn. Let's see, how about another question? I got to go to Larry. Larry asked a question. So I got to make the mic wrangler rock all the way down to the front row here.
Gary, as he said, I'm Larry.
Hi,
Nice
Larry.
to see you again. So this is a time of year we're usually waiting for pitchers and catchers to report, and instead we're waiting for the lawyers and accountants to get off the field. Given the fact that yesterday the players said no to federal mediation, where do we stand with the CBA? And what is that going to do to this season?
You know, I try not to get into the weeds too much on this. My attitude is, let me know, and let me know when you figure it out, and I'll be there. But I will say this, that the last collective bargaining agreement, the players got hosed, and the same leadership is running the union now that was running it when they got hosed, and they know they need a win. And the owners are digging in. I mean, they're the ones who called the lockout, and they didn't negotiate for a month and a half. They had 2 negotiating sessions and then screamed for a mediator, which seems absurd to me. And the players, I think, rightfully said no. I don't know. I don't know what's going to happen. We haven't really had this kind of potential conflagration since the strike that wiped out the '94 World Series, and I don't think anybody wants to lose a season. So I think they'll come to their senses at some point because there's too much money at stake. But I think there's a lot of entrenchment on both sides now, and I am not optimistic about an early settlement.
Spring training might actually happen at late spring.
Or summer. I mean, look what happened, you know, as recently as 2 years ago. We should have had a 100-game season. But because these two sides couldn't even get together in the middle of a pandemic to come up with a reasonable solution, we wound up with a 60-game season and, you know, spring training in July. So hopefully it doesn't come to that this year. Hopefully they come to their senses, but I don't think there's any chance of spring training starting on time, and we'll see from there.
All right, thanks, Gary. Appreciate it.
Okay, let's see. Oh boy, there's so many choices here. I see someone getting pointed to by people in the back over there, white Mets shirt over there with a cap on, all the way near the wall, just to make it hard. It's funny, all I could see was the fingers and a cap.
Hi, Gary. My name's Gabby, and I know this is a really hard question, but I was wondering, what's your favorite game that you've ever called?
Great question.
That's a good one. Gabby, I would say my favorite game that I ever called was 1999 League Championship Series, Game 5. If you'll remember, the Mets lost the first 3 games of the series to the Braves. They squeaked out Game 4, and Game 5 was an epic. It started at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They played in the rain for nearly 6 hours. And there were so many twists and turns and great managerial decisions, and the Mets fell behind in the 15th inning, and then they wound up winning on Robin Ventura's grand slam single. So that was the most memorable game that I've ever called.
We'll do one more in this segment. There's a gentleman with white hair right here in the middle, so if one of the wranglers can get to him, he's had his hand up each time.
Hi, Gary. My name's Art.
Hi.
How difficult was it broadcasting games last year, away games last year from Citi Field?
It was the worst. How do I even describe this?
This is a family program.
Go ahead, let it fly.
I prepped him for this question, by the way.
The whole point of having a play-by-play person to help the viewer at home with the action that's going on is that you can't see everything on TV in baseball. I broadcast basketball games remotely last winter also, and that was fine. As long as the screen is big enough and you can identify the players, it's a linear game, right? The camera is always following the action. You know, nobody hits one in another direction that you have to figure out where the ball's going. And baseball's not that way. Baseball's a non-linear game. As long as it's just pitcher and catcher, it's no problem. But once the ball's hit, what's the trajectory? What's the speed? Which direction's it going? If it's hit hard to the third baseman, does he get it? Does it go by him? Does he take a step to his left? When you watch a game on TV, you don't see those things because you can't switch the camera. The director can't switch the camera fast enough to be able to pick that up. So basically, for 3.5 hours every night during all of those road games the last 2 seasons, I lived in terror, is basically what it came down to. And our plans are to go on the road this year and do the games in person. You're clapping now, but the other caveat to that is we're not sure we're going to be able to do that for all the games. So there was one benefit to calling the games remotely last year, and that was I got to sleep in my own bed every night, and my wife liked it a lot.
But I mean, there were some strange things where it would be pouring here, thunderstorm, tropical storms. The Mets are away, and you had to get into work.
Yeah, well, that stuff happened. We also experimented with different venues. We did games from our booth at Citi Field. We did, because there were concerts going on in Citi Field, we did some games from inside the press dining room. We did some games from a remote studio in Connecticut, where everything was delayed a second, which just drove me absolutely bananas. And then we did a series in Washington late in the year, which was the only series we actually traveled to, but only the announcers traveled, and our producer and our director and all of our other people who run the pictures usually from the truck on site, they were in New Jersey and we were in Washington. And again, everything was delayed in the transmission, and it was a mess. So,
and that's also the booth furthest from the field, right? In
sorry?
The booth in Washington's the furthest from the field.
Yeah, it's funny. People always talk about that, and it's true. The booth in Washington is so high, you have a better view of the Capitol Dome than you do of the field. But I grew up sitting in the upper deck at Shea Stadium, usually in one of the top few rows behind home plate. And it is exactly the same perspective. So it bothers everybody else. For some reason, it doesn't bother me.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, it struck me when this first happened, and I don't know if I'm asking you a question or just making a statement. This was how baseball was broadcast on radio in the 1920s and 30s, right? Ronald Reagan was taking Morse code on the teletype to do Cubs games, right?
A little bit different in that the people sitting at home listening to Ronald Reagan or whoever else, Les Kiter, recreate games, they couldn't see those games. Yeah. So you could you could make up all the details. On TV, it's a little harder to do that.
Well, 2021 was an interesting season besides the challenges that you guys all faced broadcasting them, in that for a season that I don't think there's a single one of us wasn't disappointed at what happened, it actually had a lot of memorable games and some exciting moments where there were things that really stuck out in just the weirdness of this season that stuck out among games this season for you.
Well, to me, the season, the good part of the season ended July 7th. That's when Jacob deGrom went down.
Yeah.
And watching him pitch last year, and we, obviously the 2 years preceding, he had established himself as the best pitcher in baseball, and he was only building on that and getting better and better and dominating in a way that I go back to watching Sandy Koufax, And that's the only time I can remember, and I wasn't watching him every start back in the mid-'60s when I was 7 years old. The only time I can remember a pitcher being that dominant, that consistently, for that long. Yeah, part of it is the era that he's pitching in. It's a high strikeout era, but even considering that, watching deGrom pitch to me is a magical experience. And the fact that he wasn't able to come back over the second half of the season doomed this team. I mean, there were a lot of other things that went wrong, but that's where you date the Mets' downfall to. But the 15 starts that he made were one of the greatest things I've ever seen in baseball.
Yeah, it was remarkable. How many games a season do you call right now?
Well, let's see. I do 5 in spring training. I wish it were like 1. I'm not a big fan
You
of
don't need to practice.
not a big fan of spring training games. The great thing about baseball is the tension, and there's no tension. So I can do without that. I do like the weather down there, though, in February and March. So take 162 minus however many national TV games there are, which is usually between half a dozen and a dozen. And then I usually take 3 series off. So I'm somewhere around 145 maybe in a regular season.
Am I wrong in guessing, though, that you're pretty much working those games you don't call?
Well, I'm watching them,
watching
and I'm keeping score of
I
them
was gonna ask
because,
that.
well, I mean, the one thing I learned early on broadcasting baseball, when I started doing it, I was kind of daunted by it. I had always been partial toward the action sports, and my favorite thing in the world to do is to call college basketball games on the radio, which I get to do on a regular basis for Seton Hall. And it's as diametrically opposed to the experience of broadcasting baseball as anything could be, right? Baseball's 3.5 hours, college basketball's 2 hours. Baseball, there's about 7 or 8 minutes of action in that 3.5 hours. In basketball, it's constant action. Plus, I'm doing TV now for baseball and doing radio for basketball. When I first started doing baseball, my feeling was that my skills were not really suited to doing it because I was more of an action sports announcer. And I felt, especially in the minor leagues where you work solo, I thought to myself, okay, it's 140 games, that's 1,200 something innings. What am I going to talk about? And what I realized after doing about 3 weeks of my first real minor league season was that baseball is like a soap opera, right? Everything that happens today has a connection to what happened yesterday and last week and 3 years ago and 20 years ago and maybe something that happened 50 years ago. And once you start with a team in the thread of a season, everything relates to everything else. And my feeling is, and I know not every announcer feels this way, but if I am broadcasting for a team, I have to see every pitch of every game, even the ones that I'm not working, because the next day when I do come back, I can't say, well, I didn't see that game. I mean, Keith can get away with saying, I didn't do that game, but my job is to know, and that's part of what I bring to the table. I try to know as much as I can, and it's a constant feeding frenzy for me on a daily basis in baseball. It's not just the Mets games, it's everything else that's going on in every other game. To me, you need to have that update in your mind to be able to recall it because there is so much time to fill, because there are so many stories to be told, and there are so many connections to be made. And if Ronny brings something up that happened in the San Diego Pittsburgh game last night, I need to be able to build on that because it makes it more interesting rather than just sitting there dumbfounded because I have no idea what he's talking about.
It's fascinating. I never thought of it as a soap opera, but it really is a true metaphor. And I would imagine, how many hours before a game starts do you show up at the stadium? 3, 4 hours?
Honey,
Way too early.
My wife will tell you that what happens is, in a normal season, when spring training starts on time, that in late February, I dive into the deep end of the pool, and I come up for air in October. And that's basically it. It's a 24-hour-a-day job. I wake up in the morning, I get my coffee, I go on my computer, I read about everything that's happened in the last 24 hours. I take copious notes. I take a break for lunch. I get dressed, I go to the ballpark. I talk to people, I take more notes, I fill out my scorecard. So it's basically an all-day affair. Basically every waking hour during the baseball season, I am connected to that. Sorry, honey. She's lived with it for a long time.
We're going to take the lights back up and do some more questions. And I'm being tough on the Wranglers. Our first question for this segment, we're going to go all the way down here to Jerry, who always asks a question at our events each time. She's the world's biggest Curtis Granderson fan. So, but she's not going to ask a question about Curtis.
Of course she is.
Oh, you are? All the way over here.
She's going to ask me what I think about Curtis as a broadcaster, whether I'd like to see him join our booth. Hi, Jerry.
Hi, how are you?
Good.
Thank you for being here. Thank you, David. So many questions, so little time. No grandy questions. I know by definition you're the play-by-play part of the broadcast, and Keith and Ron, I guess, are considered the commentary guys. But if you dig a little deeper, like, what are the roles of each of you during the broadcast?
Yeah, I don't think we have roles, and I think that's part of why it works. Ronny likes to describe it as free-form jazz, and I think that's kind of what it is. You know, if you watch a lot of other broadcasts, particularly the national broadcasts, you can see that they have decided in advance what the topics of the day are going to be, and in the third inning we're going to do this, and in the fifth inning we're going to talk about that. Unless we have an interview scheduled with somebody, which we do maybe a dozen times a year at the most, that just doesn't happen, you know? We'll sit at dinner before the game and, you know, and just chat about the doings of the day, but we never plan what we talk about. And one of the nice things about our broadcast, I think, and, you know, I don't know how much this is true of others, is that there are nights when Ronny will do most of the talking. And there will be nights when Keith does most of the talking. And there will be nights when I do most of the talking. And nobody cares. I mean, at least within our group. Maybe you all out there would prefer that I shut up. But it's amazing to me that we have a guy who legitimately should be in the Hall of Fame. We've got a pitcher who won nearly 100 games for the Mets and, you know, was a Yale grad. And there are no egos in that booth. I mean, a lot of people say that, but it's really true. We don't care if we go on camera. We don't care who talks the most. We don't care if we step into each other's areas of expertise. We're having a good time. We're watching a game. We all have our own ways of looking at things, and we try to build off each other. And sometimes we build off the stuff that Steve does also, you know. He does more planning in terms of what he's going to be talking about with our producer. And most of the time, we don't know what he's going to talk about. But if he says something that sparks our interest, that'll start a conversation. And to me, that's what it's all about. It's about having a conversation, being human, enjoying each other's company, and trying to be, you know, as insightful and hopefully entertaining as we can be on any given night. And it depends on the game, too, right? If it's a close game, we're going to talk less and concentrate more on the game. If it's a bad game or a bad season, which is often when I say when we do our best work, we tend to digress and, you know, and get a little silly at times. And, you know, but there's no plan, I guess, is the bottom line, Jerry.
Just quickly, you guys kept me coming back when I was really disappointed way back when, and Keith is this, I mean, talk
Sorry,
about
I'm having trouble hearing you, Jerry.
Talk about soap operas. Keith is a soap opera in and of himself. But you guys are the best. You guys kept me coming back after a really tough time.
Thank you, Jerry. I appreciate that.
Oh, boy. So many arms up there. I don't even know where to turn. I'm going to go to the left-hand side, and there's a gentleman here in about the 5th row. I know there's some young folks that I talked to before. I hope some of them have questions as well.
Hey, Gary. My name is Peter. Thanks so much
Hi,
for
Peter.
being here. There's been so many interesting changes lately with things like 7-inning doubleheaders and the demand on second extra innings, and there's talk about things like automated strike zone and pace of play and DH in the National League. I'd love to hear your take on some of the changes we've seen, what you love, what you hate, what you'd like to see happen, that kind of stuff. So thanks so much.
Yeah, from a selfish standpoint, I like the 7-inning doubleheaders because the games are just so ridiculously long. And I did 7-inning minor league doubleheader games, and it never bothered me. It's a little weird, and it does change the flow of the game, but I think it creates more urgency, and frankly, I don't really mind that at all. The runner at second rule, I would prefer to see them play a couple of real baseball innings, like in the 10th and 11th, and then if it's still tied, go to that rule in the 12th. That's just my personal preference, because I think it's a gimmick and I don't like it. I understand why they started it, because they wanted to, you know, avoid the long extra inning games, particularly in the pandemic year. But, you know, in my way of thinking, teams are carrying so many pitchers now, there's no reason why you shouldn't be able to play out a 15 or 16 inning game. But to me, the compromise would be that. Something has to be done about the pace of play. For years, I resisted the idea of a pitch clock, but I think its time has come. Something has got to be done to speed up the pace. It's not the length of the game. If you speed up the pace of the game, everything else will take care of itself. I think that part of the reason why the pace has slowed down so much is because it's become such a game of power. Power pitching, power hitting. Pitchers are taking more time between pitches so that they can throw harder for longer. Hitters are trying to run through all the analytics and figuring out how they can hit a home run. And it's made the game boring. And honestly, the game needs a little more pep in its step. They experimented with a pitch clock, a fast pitch clock. I think it was like a 15-second clock last year on the low minors, and it shaved like 25 minutes off the game. But more importantly, it also raised batting averages. So there were more balls put in play, which is the other issue right now. You can't legislate the way teams approach things, right? You can't legislate teams out of trying to strike people out or trying to hit home runs, which is what the game has substantially become. But if you force pitchers to work faster, force hitters to stay in the batter's box, I think it'll have a positive impact on those things. There'll be fewer strikeouts and fewer home runs. What was the other? I hate the 3-batter minimum. I think it's a terrible rule. I think it's misguided. I think the idea was to speed up the game, but I don't think it's really worked. And I think that it hamstrings managers and allows it allows the offensive manager to put his players in positions where they can't fail, and that's just not the way the game's supposed to work. If you want to limit rosters, limit the number of pitchers on a roster, I'm okay with that. And then that would preclude, you know, managers from using 8 pitchers a game. But I think the 3-batter minimum is absurd and really should be scrapped. Did I miss any? I'm sorry? Yeah. I think that's going to be here. It's just a matter of getting the technology good enough. I'm all in favor. You know, the umpiring in baseball has been getting worse every year. I think part of that is the fact that the job's gotten more difficult every year. And with the institution of replay, I think it's made umpires second-guess themselves more. I think replay is horribly used. I think that the system now mostly doesn't work. I think that the reason the replay was put in was to save us from the egregiously bad calls. And I think that if you had a replay system where there wasn't, each team didn't have its own video room and having to call the video room in 30 seconds to make a decision, if there's a bad call, the manager should have 10 seconds to say, I challenge. And that's it, with his own eyes. If it's that bad a call, you should be able to see it with your own eyes and make that judgment without the help of all the video. Because, half the time the video room is wrong anyway. So speed the game up, get the bad calls fixed, but don't give me these calls where the runner slides into second base and comes off the bag for a millimeter for a millisecond. That's not what the rule's for. That's just ridiculous.
There's a young man, maybe 5, 6 rows down here on the aisle.
Hi, my name is Blake, and my question is, will the Mets sign Conforto this year?
That's a great question. I think the answer is no. I think if they were going to sign Conforto, they would have done so already, and they probably wouldn't have signed Starling Marte and Mark Canha. I think that, Michael has been a really, really good player for the Mets for the last 7 years, and I think a lot of people hoped that he would be more than he was. At the same time, though, this is a guy who, hit World Series home runs as a rookie and hit 33 home runs one year and was a great citizen and a great spokesman for the team and a terrific player to have. But I think that he'll be better off elsewhere. He didn't have a very good year last year, and I think he probably needs a fresh start, and I think the Mets probably do too.
Oh, boy. People are pointing.
I'm glad you've got that job and not me.
Okay, Lynn's friend Mark. I don't know who Lynn's friend Mark is, but Mark, raise your hand or stand up and we'll get the microphone to you. And we need a woman to ask, another woman to ask a question too. The guys
Hello,
are
Lynn's
done.
friend Mark.
Hi, Gary. It's Mars, but thank you.
Oh, Mars.
It's okay.
Mars.
Yeah, how are
Mars.
you, Gary? Yeah, it's me.
It's hard to see you guys
It's
up
me.
here.
So, Gary, my question is two-part. First of all, I want to say the chemistry you have with the other two gentlemen in the booth it's phenomenal. It's great television every night. It really is. My first question is it possible to get Chris Bryant? What are your feelings on that? What opinion do you have? And my second question is your signature home run call, it's out of here. Is that something that you came up with eventually? Is it something you got excited and just kind of called? Or, how did that all come about? And is it possible we could get one today?
I'll answer the last part first.
Okay.
No. Because it is something that exists in the moment. And it's an interesting question because when I was in the minor leagues, I tried very hard to come up with a signature home run call. And I tried several different things, all of which were just brutally bad. And so when I got to the major leagues, I decided not to and just kind of let it flow. And the words, it's out of here, are not unique. I mean, lots of broadcasters have used them over the years, and several use it now. I think that it was a reaction in a moment, on a ball where there was some question about whether it was going out or not, and I think the tone of voice and the intonation, it worked. And I try not to use it all the time because I think it gets played out, but it happened organically. And I think that's usually the way the best pieces come about. As for Chris Bryant, I think he's a terrific player. He's a versatile player. He'd be a great asset, and sure, not my money. Let Steve spend as much as he wants. I mean, see, that's the thing. David asked me about Steve Cohen earlier, and that's the beauty of having the richest owner in baseball. If he decides he wants another toy, he can buy another toy, and it doesn't cost him in another area unless he puts on an artificial limit. You know, we don't know what the rules are going to be as far as luxury taxes are concerned. But again, who cares? He's got $14 billion. You know, so yeah, Chris Bryant would be a tremendous addition to any team. I'm all for it.
Great, thank you.
Thanks, Matt.
We'll do one more question this segment. The woman with the hair the same color as mine. Maybe the same length as mine. Right there.
Hi, Gary. I just have to say, I love your announcing, first of all.
Thank you.
I'm going to go sentimental. With Keith being inducted into the Mets Hall of Fame in July.
No, he's already in the Mets Hall of Fame. He's having his number retired.
Well, exactly. Oh, I'm sorry.
Which is
I'm
a-
sorry.
a-
Do you
a
ever
higher up.
think, right? Do you ever think that they will retire Gary Carter's number, who happens to be my ultimate favorite?
Okay, I have to do a little bit of a disclaimer here.
Mm-hmm.
I am on the committee that decides such things.
Oh.
So I am very limited in the things that I can say.
Okay.
Let me just say that, you know, the Mets for a long time did not retire very many numbers,
Correct.
right? Casey Stengel had his
Right.
number retired. Gil Hodges had his number retired. Then Tom Seaver became the first player to have his number retired. And then it was a stretch of 20 years before Mike Piazza had his number retired. We decided to retire Jerry Kuzman's number because we thought that was long overdue. And to our mind, Keith was the next in line. And it's nice that this didn't start with Steve Cohen, by the way. This went back to the Wilpon ownership, that they wanted to, you know, open the door a little bit.
Right.
Because, you know, the Mets have 60 years of history now. It's not a young franchise anymore.
Right.
So there are more names under discussion. Let's just put it that way.
Okay.
But you know, to this, I mean, Keith will be only the fourth player to have his number
Correct.
retired, which is, you know, makes it an incredibly special honor. And let's just say we want to keep it an incredibly special honor.
Which I agree. He
Yeah.
absolutely deserves it.
I mean,
hands down.
You know, he was the guy. I compare him to Tom Seaver in some fashion because, you know, Seaver arrived with a franchise that had never won. And his presence alone changed the tenor and eventually allowed the Mets to win. And I think it was the same when Keith came over. They had been at the bottom for 6 years when he got there. And his presence alone changed the nature of the conversation, and his leadership allowed the Mets to become a championship team. So I think that, in and of itself, in addition to all the highlights and
Right.
the incredible defense and the clutch hitting, and I think he was a watershed player.
Oh, I agree.
And
Totally agree.
I think that's why his number is going up.
That's great. Not a problem. Thank you so much.
So those of you who've come to this in the past might recall one of the best things we did, most fun things we did at the last one was baseball cards. When there's a big, long stretch in a game where nothing really is happening, Gary, Keith, and Ron will randomly look at baseball cards. We can't do that with this format this year, but Gary did agree to a T-shirt toss.
I thought you were going to take out a media guide and let me read it.
Oh, yeah. I have one from like 1978.
Who's
They
on the-
didn't have Seaver on the cover. I think they had Doug Flynn on the
I was
cover.
going to say, 78, that would be Stevie Henderson, no?
Yeah. So, Gary, we have 4 T-shirts here. I don't know how your arm is today.
You don't want to know.
I could toss them, but I think it would mean more to the fans if you take.
How about you do 2 and I'll do 2?
Sounds good. So, keep your eyes open here. These do travel. We couldn't get Mr. Met and Mrs. Met. I'm going to do one way off in the corner there. That was easy. So we're a little bit behind schedule, but not too bad here, and I don't think anyone's going to mind that. We have about 20 minutes left for the auction. Things are looking good. I will tell you, This is still the bargain. This is the signed scorecard, and I'm looking at the price for it, and it's not where it should be. This way.
This is Keith's handiwork. The writing is incredible. The detail with the different colors for different pictures. He signs it at the bottom. And what makes this great is that it's reversible.
For all you Nationals fans.
It's an incredible item. Really is.
Apologize, we put a few fingerprints on it, but it will clean up very nicely. And in case you're wondering, the Mike Piazza ball is right here. So it is here. The bottle of wine from Tom Seaver is, I think, out in the lobby. Hopefully no one's grabbed it. So let's, if you don't mind, let's
Hopefully
talk.
nobody's consumed it, or we might get some really strange questions.
Yeah, so anyway, and the game packages are still a bargain compared to previous years. I'm happy with a number of the other bids so far, but I think we can do better on Keith, and I think we can do better on the game packages. So please, if you have the means to do it, it goes to a good cause. All the proceeds go to the Ridgefield Library. So you have about 19 more minutes, 18 more minutes to do that. The raffle closes in about 9 minutes. So if you still have raffle tickets or you want to buy raffle tickets, go do that now. I want to talk a little bit, use some of the packages we have just to frame a little bit of discussion. And I'm actually going to go with one that we don't have, unfortunately, but was announced in the past week or so. You're going to be a bobblehead again.
A third of a bobblehead.
A third of a bobblehead. How many Gary Cohen bobbleheads have there been produced now?
There have been no Gary Cohen only bobbleheads that I'm aware of. This will be the third Gary, Keith, and Ron bobblehead. There was one at Citi Field, or was it Citi or was it Shea? I don't even remember. Citi Field? And there was one that was actually done as a much more limited run. I think there were only about 2,000 of them that they gave out in Port St. Lucie at a spring training game years ago. So those two exist. One of the bobbleheads, and maybe I think it was the Citi Field one, Keith does not have a mustache, which I thought was an incredible oversight. I mean, there was a time when he did shave, right? There was like half a season when he went mustacheless, but I mean, come on. So I have not seen this incarnation, but what they tell me is that it's 3 separate bobbleheads, all of which connect in some fashion to create one gargantuan item.
Well, if we do this in the future, I hope we can get a hold of one of those, and we'll make that an item. Let's talk a little bit maybe about the Bobby Valentine dinner. I got to imagine you've had conversations, if not dinner, with Bobby. When I talked to Bobby about this, I figured I'd get 10 minutes of his time, and we talked for 35 minutes. What can people explain? Well, one, what are your thoughts of Bobby's reign as a manager, and maybe a little bit what people could expect if they're going to have a conversation with him?
I can rightfully say that of all the people that I have ever met in baseball, I have learned more about baseball from Bobby Valentine than I have from anybody else. And that's unequivocal. He is a baseball savant. Maybe I'll change my mind after spending a couple of years talking to Buck Showalter every day. But Bobby he's an incredible person. I mean, it's not just that he knows baseball. And he has a new book out, which I think you have.
Yeah, we do. The book is part of the
I read the
package.
book, and his life is fascinating. I mean, a lot of people probably don't know this because, it's so long ago now, but Bobby is basically the greatest athlete that the state of Connecticut has ever produced. He was not only a great baseball star in Stamford, he was a football star, he was a basketball star, he was a ballroom dancing champion, he was a bubble gum blowing champion. I mean, this guy has done everything, and he's done it at an incredibly successful level. I mean, he was supposed to be the next superstar player, but, when he left the Dodgers and went to the Angels, he messed up his leg trying to catch a ball. and a chain link fence and broke it in 2 places. And if you look at him walk now, you can see one leg is significantly shorter than the other. And he was, even after that, after this horrific, terrible injury that probably would have ended most players' careers, he was actually able to still forge a major league career after that. Became a coach at a very young age, got his first managing job with the Texas Rangers, coming straight from being the Mets' third base coach. So he knows the game and is so smart and articulates it in a way that few can. And if you haven't met Bobby, I would say that having dinner with him will be as eye-opening an experience as you've ever had.
There you have it. Tom Seaver. So I'm sure, like me, Tom's probably your all-time favorite player, all-time favorite Met. And, sadly, died, I guess, shortly before our broadcast in the 2020 season. We're going to have the statue unveiled this year. And I'm not even sure there's a way to ask a fresh question about Tom Seaver. But, to me, I've been watching a little bit with the Jerry West, and Jerry West being the NBA logo. To me, Tom Seaver's pitching form could be Major League Baseball's logo. There was nothing purer.
Well, I think that's true. I think, though, as a Met fan, what Tom Seaver represented to the Mets fans from the moment he arrived was hope, right? He was the first player who came to the Mets, and you watched him, and you listened to him, and you heard the way that he talked about the game, and then the way he approached the game, that you thought this team might someday win. And when they did win it all in '69, he was clearly the most important player on that team, and continued to be for his entire tenure until they egregiously traded him away. And
I still tear up when I hear that.
yeah, June 15th, 1977, the worst day in New York Mets history. Anyway, he was our guiding light, and there will never be another person or player who will represent the Mets more than Tom Seaver does. And that's how he earned the nickname, the franchise. And he will always be the franchise, because the Mets, as we know them, do not exist without Tom Seaver. And I got to know Tom when he was a broadcaster, and he was funny, and he was smart, and he was always Tom Seaver.
Did you ever do a game with him?
No.
No,
He was doing television when I was doing radio, yeah.
Yeah, that's too bad.
We had him on as a guest on TV several times. The best was when they put a full-page graphic of Tom up on the screen, 311 wins and whatever it is, 200-something losses. And Keith goes, "That's a lot of losses." And Tom, this is Tom Seaver, right? I mean,
well, the best thing about Seaver, he hit this high-pitched giggle.
He had a great sense of humor, but he also had a pretty big ego. But Keith is of a stature that he was able to tweak Tom in a way that most people couldn't, which was so Keith and so perfect.
Keith hit him fairly well, if I remember, actually. I think Keith did fairly well.
He wasn't Tommy Hutton, but he wasn't bad.
Yeah,
Tommy Hutton was the guy who owned Seaver.
So the raffle is now closed. I hope you all got a chance to buy. We got about 10 more minutes for the auction, which means we also have about 10 more minutes for questions. So let's get the lights back up, and you guys will take us into the close here. We haven't done enough on this side. There's two, there's a guy over there with a mask on near the wall. Yeah, they all have the mask on. I'm sorry. You got to remember, all we see are lights up here and masks. So the gentleman with his hand up in the 4th or 5th row here.
Should try working with TV lights sometime.
Oh, gosh, yeah. I do like how they have blue and orange up there, so nice job, Blake.
Sorry about that, my fellow Wall guy. Gary, so great to see you. I'm here with my son Corey from New York. Huge
Hi, Corey.
fans. So they showed it before, the Bartolo Colon call, one of the greatest calls of all time. My concern is those calls go away when the DH comes in. And so what are your feelings about the DH? I'm old school. I'm completely against it, but I'd like to hear your thoughts.
I'm with you. I mean, I understand it. I totally get it. We're in an era where, other than the National League and the Japanese Pacific League, no leagues on earth are using pitchers hitting, which means that pitchers are specializing at early ages. They have DHs in high school and in college, and so pitchers, when they get to the big leagues, are uniquely unprepared, and a lot of them get hurt hitting and running the bases, and there's so much money invested in these guys. So I get it from the standpoint of keeping pitchers healthy, but from what's good for the game and the competitive nature of the game and the strategic nature of the game, obviously we'd much prefer to still have pitchers hitting, in part because the likelihood of a pitcher getting a hit or hitting a home run is so infinitesimally small. But when you get moments like Bartolo or even Syndergaard or deGrom or hitting Sean Estes hitting a home run off Roger Clemens was one of the greatest things I've ever seen, right? Those are the magical moments, or at least some of them, in baseball. People have asked me about that call a lot, and what I tell them is that there are lots of calls that you can prepare for. You're not going to script them in advance, but a player's approaching a record, or a team's about to clinch, or a game is about to end. You're ready for those things to happen. But the ones that come out of the blue, those are the greatest, right? The things that you can't possibly anticipate, that you can't possibly prepare for, and you can hear the spontaneity and the surprise come out. And those are the things that make us fans, right? We love the everyday nature of baseball and the predictability of it, but it's the surprising stuff that keeps us engaged and that we hearken back to. And look, here we are, how many years later, still talking about a fat pitcher hitting a home run. I mean, what's better than that? So it's a shame, but I think it's going to happen, unfortunately. It actually happens to be, Jacob deGrom aside, it happens to be good for the Mets. They've got, enabling Pete Alonso to DH most of the time is going to be a good thing for the Mets. I think we're just going to have to accept that the pitcher's hitting era is drawing to a close.
Okay, how about a question from the middle? The gentleman closest to the microphone in the back, probably three rows from the back there. And then we'll take someone from over here.
How you doing, Gary?
Hi.
My name is Vince.
Hi, Vince.
We've just gone through, of course, the most recent Hall of Fame selection, and David Ortiz got in. Good for David. But of course, he is affected by the steroid era. He did test positive, and yet the greatest hitter of all time and one of the greatest pitchers did not get in. The vast majority of the voters think they should be in. 67%. I don't know what the exact numbers were. What do you think about? Well, two related questions. One, what do we do now about the steroid era, the great players of the steroid era and Hall of Fame? And two, is there a way to change the process by which the Hall of Famers are selected? Is there a way to improve it? I'm not in favor of using steroids, but come on, Clemens and Bonds, they should be in the Hall of Fame, in my opinion. And most people, I think, believe that. Most of the voters believe that. Just curious what your take is.
The first thing that I think is that I'm really, really glad I don't have a vote. Because this is the most complicated era for the Hall of Fame voters ever. I have a lot of different opinions on this, but the biggest problem that we have in terms of voting for players in the steroid era is not the guys who we know cheated. It's all the guys that we don't know cheated. Because my observation from the way the game was from the mid-90s to the mid-2000s is that the majority of players were cheating. And the people who were hurt the most were the players who weren't cheating. Every time a player used steroids, he took money and bread and at-bats and innings away from players who chose to play clean. If I had a way of knowing every player that cheated, I would say that none of them would get my Hall of Fame vote. The problem is that we don't know who cheated and who didn't. You mentioned Ortiz tested positive, but it was a test that didn't count, and so that's hard to judge. There have been allegations about other players who are already in the Hall of Fame, and they're not being busted out of the Hall of Fame. You know, Roger Clemens and Barry Bonds never tested positive, but I don't think anybody has any doubts that both of them used steroids extensively. Now, was Roger Clemens a Hall of Famer before he used steroids? Maybe. Was Bonds a Hall of Famer before he used steroids? Probably. But does that excuse them? There is a character clause, a morals clause in the Hall of Fame criteria. It all comes back to, it's very complicated. I'm really glad I don't have a vote. If I knew more, if I knew as much as I'd like to know, I'd be as hardline as I could possibly be, because all of those guys cheated the game.
We are running late, but I promised one more question, so let's see. Oh, the guy waving his hand here, looks like you've got a gray or black Mets jersey on, or sweatshirt on, sweat jacket on.
Hi, Gary, thanks for being here, appreciate it. My question's about in terms of the history of the Mets. Everybody thinks, 69, guys my age grew up on 86. And then more recently, it's the 06 guys like David Wright, Jose Reyes, and that crew. So I thought it was interesting your favorite game was 99, because I was going to ask you, do you think the Bobby V era, 98, 99, 2000, do you think they get undervalued and overlooked a little bit? And if so, is it just because they didn't finish what they set out to do?
Well, it's interesting that you phrased that the way you did, because you didn't mention 2015, right? Yeah. And I think that team gets overlooked for the same reason that the 2000 team gets overlooked. And 99 goes with that. For me, what made 99 special is that I arrived as a Mets broadcaster in 1989, which was right after the greatest 5-year period in the history of the Mets, from 84 to 88. And my first 10 years as a broadcaster, they didn't get to the postseason. So 99, which was my 11th year, was the first time I ever got to call a postseason game. And it wasn't just that, but that team had so many dramatic wins. There was the Matt Franco hit off Mariano. There was the 5 runs in the bottom of the 9th off Kurt Schilling. There was the last weekend when Rick Reed pitched the game of his life, and then they won a game in extra innings, and then the last day of the season they went on a wild pitch, and then they have a 1-game playoff, and then Todd Pratt's home run against the Dodgers.
It was an amazing team, yeah.
The year was unbelievable, but for me personally, because it was my first postseason experience, it resonates even more deeply. So I don't know if most fans look at it that way, but that's always been my favorite year. But I think you're right. I think any team that doesn't win a championship, like in '73, I mean, they came within 1 game of winning the championship. 2000, 2015, they got to the World Series, but came up short. And 2006, to me, is a 2006 is an animal all to itself because that was that. I mean, because look at it this way: in '73, they were in last place a good portion of the year. They won 82 games. They really weren't expected to be in the World Series. 2000, they had a great player in Piazza and a couple of other really good players in Olerud and Alfonso, but they weren't a great team. But they probably overachieved to get to the World Series. 2015, they remade the team at the trading deadline, got Cespedes. Again, not a great team, but they got to the World Series. But 2006, the Mets were the best team in baseball, I think. I think that was the best team that they have had since 1986, and I think it's not even close. And yet, they're remembered for losing Game 7 to the Cardinals. If they'd gotten to the World Series against the Tigers, I have no doubt they would have won, despite the fact that their pitching staff was really banged up. I mean, people forget just what happened right before. They lose Pedro, and then right before the postseason, they lose El Duque. Their pitching staff was completely torn up. That's how Oliver Perez ends up starting Game 7 against the Cardinals. He wasn't supposed to be part of their postseason rotation. So, a lot of things happened for a lot of different reasons, but that was the best team that they've had other than '86, and they didn't even get to the World Series. So, franchises are defined by their championships, no question about that. And I think that the teams that fall short, they certainly get short shrift, but that's the way the system works. As our fine commissioner would say, they didn't win the piece of metal.
Thank you.
We're going to bring down the raffle buckets, Lorene and crew, and we're going to have Gary pick the raffles. While they're walking down, let's do a quick survey. How many games will the Mets win this year? Less than 70? Okay, we have one person who thinks they're going to win less than 70. He obviously is not counting on the CBA being signed.
Maybe he thinks it's going to be a 100-game season.
Yeah. How many think they'll win more than 70? More than 80? More than 90? Now we're going to touch the third rail. More than 100? Okay. So the first time we ever did this...
Now you got to, wait a second, you have to do the Keith number. The Keith number.
What's the Keith number?
How many Mets teams have won 108, you would say?
Yeah. Now, I just want to put this in context. When we did this in 2017, more than half the audience said that they were going to win more than 90 games, and a good quarter of the audience said more than 100 games. So take it for what it's worth. But
thank you. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you.
Support the Ridgefield Library.